I guess it all started with that knock on the door. You know, the kind of knock that breaks the silence of a lazy afternoon when you're home alone. I was in my kitchen, reheating last night's Chinese takeout, wearing my favorite oversized sweatshirt. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays are usually dead quiet around here in our little suburban neighborhood. I wasn't expecting anyone. Josh, my husband, was out on a work trip like he always was. He's in sales, constantly flying across the country, landing deals in hotels with names I can't even pronounce. He'd left the night before after another half-hearted goodbye, the kind where he looks at his phone more than me. We hadn't been close in a long time. The knock came again, this time louder. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door, expecting some delivery mix-up or a neighbor looking for a missing package. I opened it, and there he was. "Hey, mail delivery," he said with a crooked smile, holding up a small package. His uniform shirt hugged his chest and shoulders just a little too well. His name tag read Aiden, but I didn't even notice it right away. His smile caught me off guard. It wasn't just polite, it was warm, genuine, like he was actually happy to see me. "Oh, thanks," I stammered, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Smooth, I know." He handed me the box, and our hands brushed for a second. Just a second. But it was enough to send this little jolt up my arm, like when you touch a metal doorknob after shuffling across a carpet. It was stupid, really, but I noticed. "No problem," Aiden said, lingering for a moment like he was waiting for me to say something else. Instead, I just stood there like an idiot. Eventually, he gave me another quick smile and walked back to his truck. I watched him leave through the window, wondering why my heart was beating a little faster. Episode 2, The Longest Day. The next few days dragged by, as they usually did when Josh was gone. Work was dull. Evenings felt endless. I'd sit on the couch, binge-watching shows I didn't even care about, just to drown out the silence. You'd think I'd be used to it after 5 years of marriage, but lately, it felt heavier. Josh and I had drifted apart, there's no sugarcoating it. We didn't fight much, we just stopped trying. He was always busy, always tired, and I guess I stopped being someone he looked forward to coming home to. I tried talking to him about it once, a couple of months ago, but he brushed it off with some excuse about work stress. "You think I don't want to be here more?" "I'm doing this for us," he had said, his tone clipped, like I was being ungrateful. After that, I stopped bringing it up. What was the point? But then. Aiden. I don't know how to explain it, but after that first encounter, I started noticing every little thing. I'd hear his truck pull up around noon every other day, the hum of the engine breaking the stillness of the neighborhood. I wasn't waiting by the door or anything, at least, not at first. But eventually, I found myself hoping for another knock. And I got one. Episode 3, Small Talk. This time, it was Friday. I had taken the day off work, telling myself I needed a mental health day, which was true, kind of. When I heard the knock, I practically leapt off the couch. I took a second to compose myself, pretending I hadn't been eagerly anticipating his arrival. "Hey," I said, opening the door. "Another package?" "Nope, just your usual mail." He handed me a small stack of letters and a couple of ads. He lingered again, his eyes meeting mine. "How's your day going?" "Pretty quiet," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I took the day off work." "Nice. Everyone needs a break sometimes," he replied. His voice was warm, easy. He wasn't rushing to leave this time, and I didn't want him to. We chatted for a bit, small talk, really. He told me about some of the weird deliveries he's had to make in other neighborhoods. I laughed more than I had in weeks. There was something disarming about him, like he wasn't trying too hard to impress me. He was just real. Before he left, he gave me that same smile, the one that made my stomach do a little flip. "See you around," he said, and I nodded, already looking forward to the next time. Episode 4, Crossing the Line. It became a routine. Aiden would show up a few times a week, and we'd talk. Sometimes it was only for a minute or two, but other times we'd get lost in conversation. I started looking for excuses to be outside when I knew he'd be coming by, watering the garden, checking the mailbox even when I knew it was empty. The tension between us grew slowly, like a simmer you don't notice until the water's about to boil. It wasn't just harmless flirting anymore, and we both knew it. One afternoon, when the sky was overcast and the air was heavy with the promise of rain, it finally happened. I invited him inside. It was innocent at first. I offered him a glass of water, and he accepted. We stood in the kitchen, talking like always, but this time, the air felt charged. He leaned against the counter, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my breath hitch. "Aiden, this probably isn't a good idea," I whispered, though I didn't sound convincing even to myself. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But it feels like we've been heading here for a while, doesn't it?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I hadn't felt this alive in years. When he kissed me, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, like he wanted to savor every second. I melted into him, forgetting everything else, Josh, the house, the promises I had made. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. When it was over, the room felt different, like the walls themselves were holding a secret. Aiden and I sat in silence for a while, the rain outside tapping lightly on the windows. I traced my fingers over the edge of my coffee mug, unable to look at him. The weight of what we'd just done was crashing down on me like a tidal wave. "I should go," Aiden said softly, breaking the quiet. He wasn't cold or regretful, just cautious. I think he could tell I was already spiraling. "Yeah," I whispered, avoiding his eyes. He stood up and adjusted his shirt, his face conflicted. "Claire," he began, but I shook my head. "Don't. Just, not right now." He nodded, hesitated for a moment, and then walked to the door. I followed, keeping my arms wrapped around myself. Before he left, he turned back one last time. "You're not alone, you know," he said gently. And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the rain. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. I wanted to cry, to scream, to rewind the last few hours and undo what had just happened, but I didn't. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen as if scrubbing away the evidence would somehow erase my guilt. Episode 6, The Guilt Trip. The next few days were a blur. Josh called once from Seattle. I could hear the tiredness in his voice, the way he rushed through the conversation like it was just another task on his to-do list. "How's everything at home?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. "Fine," I said, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Same as always." "Good. I'll be back Friday. We'll do something, okay? Maybe dinner." "Sure," I replied, knowing full well we'd probably end up eating takeout on opposite ends of the couch like always. After I hung up, I sank onto the bed, the weight of my choices crushing me. I kept replaying that afternoon with Aiden in my mind, the way he touched me, the way he looked at me like I was something precious. I hadn't felt that kind of connection in years, but it didn't make the betrayal any less real. I tried to distract myself by diving into work, but it didn't help. Every time I passed the mailbox, I half expected Aiden to be there, waiting with that easy smile. He didn't come for days, and I wondered if he was giving me space, or if he regretted it. But then, on Thursday, I saw his truck pull up. Episode 7, Treading Dangerous Waters. I was outside, trimming the hedges when I saw him. My heart pounded as he stepped out of the truck, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, He gave a small wave and walked toward me. "Hey," he said, his voice careful, like he didn't know where we stood. "Hey," I replied, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. I glanced around, half expecting a nosy neighbor to pop out of nowhere, but the street was quiet. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. I nodded and led him around to the backyard where we could have some privacy. We sat on the patio, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't want things to be weird between us," he said after a moment. "I know what happened was complicated." "Complicated?" I let out a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it. I'm not here to make things harder for you, Claire. I care about you. I don't regret it, but I also know this isn't easy for either of us." His honesty hit me harder than I expected. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who wasn't just a distraction from my problems. He was a good man caught in a situation neither of us had planned for. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted quietly. "Josh and we've been falling apart for a long time. But that doesn't excuse what I did. What we did." "You're not a bad person," Aiden said softly. "You're just human." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the breeze rustling the trees. It was strangely comforting, being with him like this, no masks, no pretending. "I don't know what happens next," I finally said. "But I can't keep living like this. Something has to change." "Then change it," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You deserve to be happy, Claire. Whether that's with Josh, with me, or by yourself, you deserve that." His words stayed with me long after he left. Episode 8, The Ultimatum. When Josh came home that Friday, I was ready to talk. I'd spent the entire day rehearsing what I wanted to say. I wasn't going to confess, at least not yet. But I needed to tell him how I felt, how lonely and disconnected I'd become in this marriage. We sat at the dinner table, the tension palpable. Josh was scrolling through his phone, barely touching his food. I cleared my throat, and he finally looked up. "Josh, can we talk?" He sighed, setting his phone down. "What's on your mind?" "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I feel like we're living separate lives. You're always gone, and when you're here, it's like you're not really present. I need more than that." He frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You know I'm working hard for us, Claire. What do you want me to do? Quit my job?" "I want you to care," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "I want you to look at me like you used to. I want us to try." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then his expression softened. "I didn't realize it had gotten this bad," he admitted quietly. "I thought we were just in a rut. But if you're serious, then maybe we need to figure this out together." It wasn't exactly the heartfelt declaration of love I'd been hoping for, but it was something. A small crack in the wall we'd built between us. Episode 9, Second Chances and Stolen Glances. Josh promised to make an effort. He even suggested taking a weekend trip together, just the two of us. I wanted to believe it could work, that we could find our way back to what we used to be. But in the back of my mind, Aiden lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. That weekend, Josh and I drove to a cabin in the mountains. It was beautiful, surrounded by pine trees, with a lake nearby reflecting the late summer sky. For the first time in a long time, it was just us. No work calls, no emails, no distractions. We hiked, cooked together, and sat by the fire talking late into the night. He told me about how stressed he'd been with work, how he'd felt like he was letting me down but didn't know how to fix things. I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with, and for a while, I let myself believe we had a chance. But as the trip came to an end, reality crept back in. We returned home, and by Monday morning, he was back to checking emails before he even finished his coffee. The cycle was starting all over again. That afternoon, Aiden showed up with a delivery. I didn't mean to talk to him. I really didn't. But when he smiled at me and asked how I was doing, the truth spilled out before I could stop it. I told him about the trip, about how Josh was trying but how it still didn't feel like enough. I want to believe things can get better, I said, my voice cracking. But I don't know if I can anymore. Aiden listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When I finally finished, he reached out and gently took my hand. You don't have to make any decisions right now, he said softly. But you deserve to be honest with yourself. What do you really want, Claire? I didn't have an answer. At least, not one I was ready to say out loud. Episode 10, Lines We Can't Uncross. Over the next few weeks, I tried to keep my distance from Aiden. I threw myself into work and focused on spending more time with Josh. He was making an effort, I could see that, but there was still this wall between us. It was like we were two actors playing our roles, going through the motions of a marriage we both knew was broken. One Friday evening, Josh came home late after a business dinner. He was tipsy, laughing at some joke I didn't understand as he stumbled through the door. I helped him to bed, and as he drifted off, he mumbled, "Love you, Claire." I stared at him, my heart aching. Did he really mean it? Or was it just habit at this point? The next day, I saw Aiden again. I thought I wouldn't see you anymore, he said, his eyes searching mine. I thought that too, I admitted, crossing my arms to steady myself. But here I am. We walked to the edge of my yard, where the trees provided some privacy. The air between us was charged, the unspoken tension crackling like electricity. I think about you more than I should, I confessed quietly, my gaze fixed on the ground. But I'm trying to make things work with Josh. Aiden nodded slowly. I get it. I do. But you deserve to be happy, Claire. You can't keep living for someone else's expectations. His words echoed in my mind long after he left. I spent the rest of the day wandering through the house, haunted by the choices I'd made and the ones I still hadn't. Episode 11, Breaking Point. It all came to a head one night a few weeks later. Josh was home, but barely. He was in his office, working on some last-minute report for a client. I sat alone in the living room, the sound of the TV doing little to fill the emptiness around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked into his office and leaned against the doorframe. Josh, can we talk? He didn't even look up. Can it wait? I'm swamped right now. No, I said firmly. It can't wait. This is important. He sighed and finally turned his chair to face me. Okay. What's going on? I can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. We're not happy, Josh. We're barely even a couple anymore. I know you're trying, but it's not enough. We've both changed, and I don't think we can fix this. He stared at me in shock, like he hadn't seen this coming. Claire, what are you saying? I'm saying I think we need to separate, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore. We deserve more than this, both of us. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he nodded slowly, his expression heartbroken but resigned. I guess I've known this was coming, he said quietly. I just didn't want to admit it. We sat in silence, the weight of our marriage crumbling around us. It wasn't dramatic or messy, just two people acknowledging that their time together had run its course. Episode 12, New Beginnings. In the days that followed, Josh and I began the process of untangling our lives. We agreed to separate amicably, dividing our belongings without much argument. He moved into a temporary apartment, and for the first time in years, I found myself alone in the house. It was strange, liberating and terrifying all at once. A few days later, Aiden showed up again. This time, I didn't hold back. I told him everything, about the separation, about how lost I'd felt, and how I was finally starting to figure out what I wanted. "And what do you want now?" he asked gently. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I felt sure of my answer. "You," I said simply. "I want you." He smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that had disarmed me all those months ago. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of the past finally lifting. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't some fairy tale ending. But it was real, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. End of story.